Before we begin, I have one small favor to ask. A lot of you are watching and listening right to the end, but haven't subscribed. So if you're enjoying these stories, please hit the subscribe button. It genuinely helps us keep bringing these incredible mountain stories to life. Now, let's head over to the Himalaya. Broad Peak killed Nirmal Purja before he could finish what may have become the final great record of his climbing life. But there is something about that story that almost nobody noticed. Something strange. Because even if Broad Peak had not killed him, even if there had been no avalanche, even if Nims had reached the summit, returned safely to base camp, and gone home, he could not have finished the record. Not yet. Because after Broad Peak, only one mountain would have remained. Cho Oyu, the sixth highest mountain on Earth, towering at 8,188 meters. There was another problem, one that no climber could overcome with strength, experience, or courage. China had already closed the mountain to foreigners forever. And just like that, years of preparation, sacrifice, and obsession ended without a single step toward the summit. The mountain was still there, but the dream was suddenly out of reach.
Wait, forever? But why? Too dangerous?
It's actually closed until an undetermined date, but definitely not for the rest of this year. Not because an avalanche had destroyed the route, not because of a storm, not because Cho Oyu had suddenly become too dangerous. In fact, China had also closed Shishapangma and the north side of Mount Everest. 3 enormous doors into the Tibetan Himalayas closed. And according to mountaineering sources, the reason may lead back to something almost ridiculous. Something that lasted 52 seconds.
52 seconds?
Yeah. Fireworks. More than 1,000 of them. 1,050 to be exact, exploding across a Tibetan mountainside. And the company behind the spectacle wasn't an oil company. It wasn't a mining company. It wasn't some corporation with no connection to the wilderness. It was one of the most famous outdoor companies on Earth. You won't believe this. It's Arcteryx, which leaves us with a big, boiling question. Arcteryx sponsored the fireworks, something that causes so much disruption to the environment, an already fragile mountain region. An artist created them. Officials approved them. So why are climbers the ones standing outside a locked gate? And perhaps an even harder question, should China open the mountains again? Because to understand how we arrived here, we have to go back 7 years. 2019. To another Nims Purja record, another final mountain, and strangely, another closed door in China. In 2019, almost nobody outside serious mountaineering circles knew the name Nirmal Purja. Then he announced something that sounded absurd. There are 14 mountains on Earth higher than 8,000 meters, the 14 giants. Everest, K2, Kanchenjunga, Lhotse, Makalu, Cho Oyu, Dhaulagiri, Monslu, Nanga Parbat, Annapurna, Gasherbrum 1, Broad Peak, Gasherbrum 2, and Shishapangma. Some of the greatest climbers in history had spent years, sometimes decades, trying to climb them all. Nims wanted to do it in 7 months. 7 months! He called it Project Possible, and then he started climbing. Annapurna, Dhaulagiri, Kanchenjunga, Everest, Lhotse, Makalu. 6 mountains. Then he headed to Pakistan. Nanga Parbat, done. Gasherbrum 1, Gasherbrum 2, K2, Broad Peak, 11 done. Then Cho Oyu, 12 done. Then Monslu, 13 done. And suddenly, the impossible project had become very possible. Only 1 mountain left. Shishapangma. But Shishapangma had a problem. It sits entirely inside Tibet, which you could go to at one point from India. There is no Nepalese side, no Pakistani side, no alternative border. To climb Shishapangma, you need China. And China had closed the mountain. Imagine that. You survived Annapurna, you've crossed K2, you've climbed Everest, You've pushed through 13 of the 14 highest places on Earth, and now the thing standing between you and history isn't ice. It isn't altitude. It isn't your body. It's bureaucracy, a permit, a piece of paper. Nims couldn't simply sneak around it. If China said no, there was no 14th mountain. Project Possible would stop at 13.
So after everything he had climbed, the thing that almost stopped him was permission.
Exactly. And that becomes very important later because this wasn't the last time. There were appeals, discussions, and pressure. The Nepalese government became involved. Nims waited and waited. And eventually, China made an exception. A special permit was issued. The mountain opened on October 29th, 2019. And just like that, Nims Purja reached the summit of Shishapangma. 14 mountains, 6 months and 6 days. Project Possible was complete. And years later, millions of people would know that story through Netflix. The 14 Peaks, Nothing is Impossible. It's a brilliant title, but there was always a strange little footnote hiding underneath it. Because in 2019, something actually had been impossible. Shishapangma, until China said otherwise. So if Shishapangma is a Tibetan mountain, how does China become involved?
What I see is with mountaineering community, all these mountains on the Western Himalayas, Karakoram, K2, Kashipuram 1, 2, Broad Peak, Nanga Parbat, they all call them, they are in Pakistan. And what I see with the Shishapangma and Everest, from north side of Everest, they call them in China, which is not true for both of them. Because you need Pakistani visa to get to Islamabad and to get to the Gilgit-Baltistan, you say, they are in Pakistan because you needed Pakistan visa to get there. Similarly, for China, you need their visa to get to the Tibetan side, the north side of Everest, and to Shishapangma, you need Chinese visa. So because you need these both visas, you think that they are in China and in Pakistan. That is simply not true. They both are in the occupied territory of, respectively, first, Gilgit-Baltistan in Pakistan, which we call it in Pakistan Sea, and the other one is actually in Tibet, not in China.
So, until China said otherwise, Nims had discovered something that every 14 Peaks climber eventually has to understand. You don't just need strength. You don't just need money. You don't just need weather. You need access. The mountains may belong to geography, but the gates belong to the governments. And at that time, that was simply one dramatic chapter in Project Possible. Nobody knew that 7 years later, the same problem would return, except this time, the story would end very differently. Now, there's an important detail here. People still sometimes say Nims Purja holds the fastest record for climbing all 14 8,000-meter mountains. He doesn't. That record was broken. In 2023, Kristen Harila and Tenjan Lama Sherpa completed the 14 in 92 days. Nim's famous 2019 speed record was gone.
Did she do it without oxygen then?
No. She did this record with oxygen at some points. It's just much too taxing on a female body to do the speed record without oxygen. And that's okay.
Of course.
There are all kinds of different combinations of records, and records are meant to be eventually broken. Someone shows the world record, something can be done, and eventually someone comes along and does it faster. But Nims wasn't done with the 14 mountains. Huge amounts of criticism had always followed Project Possible. It was always about oxygen. Nims used supplemental oxygen on many of those 2019 climbs. And in traditional high-altitude mountaineering, there is a very different level of respect attached to climbing the 8,000-meter mountain without bottled oxygen. Above 8,000 meters, the human body is already dying. The amount of oxygen available is roughly a third of what we breathe at sea level. Decision-making deteriorates, your muscles weaken, every moment becomes expensive. So Nims went back and began climbing the 14 again, without supplemental oxygen. One after another, until October 2024. Shishapangma, again. The same mountain that had nearly stopped his first 14 Peaks project, nearly 5 years prior, became the mountain where he was almost denied the completion of the next record. 13 were completed.
Was it the Chinese government again?
Well, yes, they created a bizarre problem for someone whose entire record depended on not using oxygen. No mountains over 7,000 meters were allowed to be climbed without O2.
What? Wow. Obviously, they were thinking safety, but how did he bypass this rule then?
Well, there is only speculation, and no one has ever come cleanly. But either he obtained an exception through perhaps some deliberation between the government representatives, or he went there and just climbed it without O2, which is what Mingmaji confirms later. They weren't actually allowed, but they did it anyway, without supplemental oxygen.
So, how long did it take him?
It took him 2 years, 4 months, and 28 days, which smashed the previous record set by South Korean mountaineer Kim Chang-ho. He completed them in 7 years and 310 days, finishing the project on the 20th of May, 2013. But even then, he wasn't finished because something else was quietly happening. Nims had climbed many of these mountains more than once, and eventually a new possibility appeared, a record nobody had ever completed. What if you climbed all 14 8,000-meter mountains twice without supplemental oxygen? Think about that. Not 14 summits, 28. This is 2 Everests, 2 K2s, 2 Annapurnas, 2 Nanga Parbats, 2 Kanchenjungas, 2 Broad Peaks, 2 Cho Oyus, every one of the 14 again, without bottled oxygen. Nobody had done it. And by 2026, Nims was getting frighteningly close. This is where our story returns to Pakistan. His original plan was Gasherbrum 2, he climbed it, and then Nims looked at what remained. There were 2 left, Broad Peak and Cho Oyu. Broad Peak was right there. Pakistan, same expedition, same season. Why leave? Why not take the opportunity? If he climbed Broad Peak, the entire world record would come down to 1 mountain, Cho Oyu. 1 last summit, 1 final, no oxygen ascent. And Nims Purja would become the first person in history to climb every 8,000-meter mountain twice without supplemental oxygen. Broad Peak had not originally been the main objective, but now it represented something irresistible, history. So Nims stayed, and that decision would become the final decision of his climbing life. It was his fate. Broad Peak is a beautiful, massive mountain. It feels less like a mountain you simply see and more like one that slowly reveals itself. It rises from the Karakoram in a long sweeping wall of snow and light, its summit stretched across the horizon as though the mountain were reaching for the sky rather than piercing it. Beside the sharp, intimidating presence of K2, Broad Peak can seem almost graceful, quieter, softer, more distant. In the early morning, the first sunlight catches its upper slopes and turns the ice pale gold. At dusk, the mountain fades into blue and silver, suspended above the Baltoro Glacier like something half real and half dream. It rises to 8,051 meters in Pakistan's Karakoram region. From base camp, climbers can look towards some of the most dangerous mountains on Earth. And in July 2026, conditions were becoming increasingly uncomfortable. Heavy snow had accumulated. Other climbers had already reconsidered their plans. Some left. But Nims and the remaining teams continued. And perhaps, from his perspective, the mathematics were difficult to ignore. Broad Peak now, Cho Oyu later. 28 summits, a record nobody had ever touched. On July 30th, Nims and other climbers moved upward from Camp 2, and for hours everything appeared normal. And then the mountain moved. An avalanche tore through the climbing line. 10 people died, among them Nims Purja, the man who had built his public identity around this phrase, "Nothing is impossible." Broad Peak became his final mountain, and the record ended right there. But while researching that tragedy, one detail kept bothering us, because Nims had already told people what came next. If Broad Peak succeeded, only Cho Oyu remained, except Cho Oyu was closed for good. This is where the story gets almost cruel. Imagine another version of July 30th. The avalanche doesn't happen, Nims climbs through, he reaches Broad Peak summit, he comes down safely, he flies home, he recovers, and he announces the final climb. Cho Oyu, the 28th no oxygen summit. History waiting at 8,188 meters, except He couldn't go. China had closed the mountain to foreign expeditions. The final mountain was there. Nims would have been alive, ready, capable, and still unable to finish. Not because the mountain said no, because the border did. And this wasn't just Cho Oyu. Shishapangma was also unavailable, and Everest's Tibetan north side is closed.
So what happened? Why would China shut down international access to three of the most famous Himalayan climbing objectives on Tibetan territory?
Well, to answer that, we have to leave Broad Peak, leave Nims, leave Pakistan, and go back to September 2025. First and foremost, the permits are actually administered by the Chinese Tibetan Mountaineering Association. So it's not necessarily the government. They're the ones that are either giving out the permits or not giving out the permits. So let's go back to September 2025 to a quiet mountainside in Tibet. September 19th to be exact. High in the Tibetan plateau, an unusual installation had been prepared. Rows of pyrotechnics had been positioned across a mountainside. The elevation ran roughly between 4,670 and 5,020 meters. More than 1,000 individual fireworks units were involved. The concept belonged to internationally celebrated Chinese artist Guo-Qiang. Kai is famous for using gunpowder, explosions, smoke, fire. His work has appeared around the world, and this project had a dramatic name, Ascending Dragon. The idea was to make a dragon appear to climb the mountainside, and there was a major commercial partner behind it, Arcteryx, one of the most recognizable outdoor brands in the world. A company associated with mountains, climbers, alpine environments, technical clothing built specifically for people who spend their lives trying to protect themselves from the mountains. And then they lit the fuse. For approximately 52 seconds, fireworks exploded across the Tibetan slope. Yellow, red, blue, smoke, and there was fire. A dragon seemed to race upward through the landscape. Visually, it was spectacular. And then people saw where it had happened, and the reaction changed almost immediately. First, the people heavily criticized on one of their chatting apps called WeChat, and then it got involved to the Chinese state media. And then afterwards, the environmental activists of the Tibetan environmental teams, they also got involved with the heavy criticism. So it just kind of moved up and up and up the ladder. And finally, the attention came to the Chinese government. So what were they thinking? The backlash was enormous because there was an obvious question. What exactly was an outdoor company doing setting off more than 1,000 pyrotechnics on fragile, high-altitude terrain? People questioned the effect on the soil, the grasslands, wildlife, the debris that was left over, the firework residue went into the soil, the noise, and the cultural meaning of the landscape that was disturbed. And above everything else, there was the hypocrisy. Arcteryx sells an idea, not just jackets, an idea. Wild places with mountain culture and adventure. Respect for difficult environments. Ski remote slopes, camp in storms, walk miles to reach places specifically because they don't look like cities. And now that same company had helped turn a Tibetan mountainside so peaceful into a pyrotechnic stage for 52 seconds. The criticism came quickly. Arcteryx apologized. Kai apologized, but China did not stop at apologies. The authorities opened an investigation. And that's when the story began to get bigger. The official investigation later reconstructed what had actually happened. Approximately 1,050 fireworks units, a performance lasting roughly 52 seconds, pyrotechnics positioned across elevations approaching 5,000 meters. This is a place where the ecology is so fragile. Investigators calculated that more than 30 hectares of grassland had been affected. They found disturbance to the soil and grass mat structure. They found material that had not been completely removed. This mattered because alpine vegetation at these elevations is not suburban lawn. It's cold, thin soil. They have short growing seasons and very slow recovery. and damage can remain visible long after the people responsible have gone home. This affects everything around it. It's a circle of life. It's the whole entire ecology and the ecological biome. And suddenly the story wasn't whether people liked the artwork. It was about responsibility. Who authorized this? Who inspected the location? Who decided the environmental safeguards were sufficient? Who said yes? Because you don't carry 1,050 fireworks onto a mountain in Tibet and install them over a large area and bring in an internationally famous artist along with major global brands and accidentally forget to ask for permission. And it doesn't happen overnight. Somebody approved it.
And that's the part that makes no sense to me. How does something this big get approved? And if everyone later says it shouldn't have happened?
Exactly. And that became China's question too. Investigators focused not only on the artist and the company, but on government officials. The official findings concluded that local officials in Guangxi County had failed in the approval and oversight process. Some officials were disciplined, some lost positions. Arc'teryx became responsible for ecological restoration and compensation. Kai's studio faced further scrutiny. So at this point, you might think the story is finished. A company makes a disastrous marketing decision. People become angry. The company apologizes. Officials investigate. People are punished. The damage gets repaired eventually. And everyone moves on. Except they didn't. Because as 2025 became 2026, something else happened. The international climbing permits didn't come.
So the permits have just recently been rejected from an event that happened last year?
Yes. Everest North closed to foreign expeditions, Cho Oyu closed, Shishapangma closed for all international mountaineers. 3 of Tibet's most important high-altitude objectives simply disappeared from the calendar. And the timing was impossible to ignore.
But why now?
Well, the climbing industry sources reported that the restrictions were linked to the continuing fallout from the fireworks investigation. Now, we have to be precise. We have not found a public Chinese government statement saying, because Arc'teryx set off the fireworks, we are closing Everest North, Cho Oyu, and Shishapangma. That would be a much cleaner story. But we don't have that. What we have are mountaineering sources describing the closures as connected to the ongoing investigation. And that distinction matters because it leaves us with a mystery. If this was simply about environmental damage on one mountainside, why would climbing permits elsewhere in Tibet become entangled in that aftermath? Unless authorities were looking at something larger. Perhaps not merely what happened, but how was it allowed to happen?
Well, it would be tough to find the actual people who are to blame.
Yes. Think about the word that connects almost everything in this story, the permission. Nims needed permission for Shishapangma in 2019. Foreign climbers need permission for Cho Oyu. They need permission for Everest North. Arc'teryx and Kai needed permission for their fireworks display. Different activities, different people, but the same fundamental system. Someone decides who gets access. Someone signs the paperwork. Someone approves an expedition. Someone approves an event. Someone says yes. So when a spectacularly controversial event happens and authorities discover problems with the approval process, what do investigators naturally begin examining? The permission. Who gave it? Why? Under what rules? And whether those rules were actually being followed. Now we're getting somewhere. Because in 2026, another name suddenly appeared. May 2026 to be exact. Nyima Tsering, Director and Deputy Party Secretary of the Tibet Autonomous Region Sports Bureau, a significant figure in Tibetan sport. And he's deeply connected with the region's mountaineering establishment. Chinese authorities announced that he was being investigated for suspected serious violations of discipline and law. That is confirmed. But what exactly had he done? The public announcement actually didn't say. It didn't mention Arc'teryx, nor the fireworks, or Everest, Cho Oyu, and Shishapangma. It didn't mention expedition permits. So we cannot simply connect those dots ourselves. But imagine you're watching this unfold from Kathmandu. The fireworks scandal, local officials disciplined, Tibetan climbing access frozen. Then the head of the region sports bureau is placed under serious investigation. Would people start asking questions? Of course they would. And then on August 19, 2026, the story became even stranger. A report from Kathmandu said expedition operators had now been told that foreign climbing access to the 3 big mountains, Cho Oyu, Shishapangma, and Everest North, would remain unavailable through the rest of 2026. Bookings were all being canceled. Climbers would have to wait. But buried inside that report was a much more explosive claim. Unnamed sources described as close to the China-Tibet Mountaineering Association alleged that authorities were also examining financial corruption connected with permits for foreign expeditions. The report went even further, claiming that high-level officials had been jailed. Now stop, because this is precisely where stories like this become dangerous. There is a huge difference between reported and proved. We searched for independent evidence confirming those jailings. The names, official detention notices, court proceedings, criminal charges, sentences. And as of now, we have not found enough corroboration to tell you the allegation is an established fact. The corruption claim also remains tied to a few unnamed sources. So we're not going to tell you China uncovered a giant corruption mountaineering permit scheme. We cannot prove that, but the allegations matter. Because someone close enough to the climbing system believed something deeper was being investigated. And suddenly those 52 seconds of fireworks began to look less like the end of the story and more like the moment somebody started asking questions.
So what you're saying is the fireworks could have been the thing that made investigators start looking at who was approving everything. What does this even mean then?
There are at least 2 ways to interpret what happened. The first is straightforward. The fireworks caused genuine environmental controversy. Officials were found to have failed in their responsibilities during the investigations. Also, reports alleged that authorities were investigating financial corruption connected to permits issued to foreign expeditions. Some were getting permits while others were not. Further, a lot of the expeditions that were given permits weren't being held accountable for their environmental footprint. Authorities froze related activities while reviewing the system, and foreign climbing permits were caught in that freeze. The fireworks themselves may not have had anything to do with climbing, but they raised a much bigger question. Who was giving people permission to operate in these protected mountains? And how were those decisions being made? Exposing a system that was in the eyes of the Tibetan and Chinese governments causing more harm than good.
Why should other climbers have to pay for the misdemeanor of others then?
And this is where I want to hear from you, because there is an obvious argument against the closures. Arcteryx sponsored the event. Kai created it. Officials approved it. A Polish climber did not. An American climber did not. A Nepali guide did not. A Spanish mountaineer sitting on 13 of the 14 peaks did not. So why should they be punished for it? Why should they be denied access to the mountains? Imagine you've spent 12 years working towards the 14 8,000ers. You've climbed K2 and you've survived. Annapurna and you survived. You spent tens of thousands of dollars, maybe hundreds of thousands, and lost toenails, suffered frostbite. You've missed birthdays. You've trained while everyone else slept. 13 mountains are done, and your final mountain is Shishapangma. You are physically ready. Your team is ready. You have the money, you have the experience, you have the desire. But the mountain is closed. Not because of something you did, not because of anything your expedition company did, but because somewhere else in Tibet, a corporation sponsored 52 seconds of fireworks. Would that feel fair?
No, I'd be furious.
Absolutely. I would be furious as well. And I think most climbers would be as well. But then we have to ask something uncomfortable. Why do we assume fairness is the deciding factor?
Then who owns the right to climb?
That is the most important question. Foreign climbers don't own Cho Oyu. They don't own Shishapangma. They don't own Everest. A climbing permit isn't a human right. It's permission granted by the country controlling the land. So perhaps China would answer the question differently or pose the question differently. Maybe it isn't, why are innocent climbers being punished? Maybe it's, why should foreign climbers assume these mountains must remain permanently available for them, especially if authorities believe something is wrong with the system managing access? The Tibetan plateau is ecologically fragile. It is culturally significant. It's politically sensitive, as we discussed earlier. And it is home to people whose relationship with these mountains extends far beyond climbing records. It is spiritual. So perhaps closing access temporarily is not a punishment at all. Perhaps it's a precaution. Perhaps China looked at what happened with Ascending Dragon and decided, stop. Before we approve anything else, we need to understand how this was allowed. If that's the explanation, the story changes.
But there's a cost.
Yes, closing a mountain doesn't only affect wealthy foreign climbers. Himalayan mountaineering is an economy. There's guides, high altitude workers, cooks, drivers, base camp crews, logistic companies, expedition operators, hotels, transport. Hundreds of people can be connected to a single commercial climbing season. When Cho Oyu disappears from the calendar, clients lose an expedition, but workers also lose work. When Shishapangma closes, someone chasing a record has to wait, but someone who earns a living organizing those expeditions also waits. And now this becomes even harder. Who should pay for Arc'teryx's mistake? Arc'teryx? The artist? The officials who approved it? The expedition companies? The guides? Foreign climbers? Or should protecting the mountain come before all of them? I keep coming back to Arc'teryx because if another company had sponsored this, the reaction might have been a little different. Imagine a fireworks manufacturer did it. People would say, oh, that's reckless. Imagine a luxury car company did it. People would say, corporate excess. But Arc'teryx, that's different because Arc'teryx sells mountain identity. A $900 shell isn't just waterproof fabric, it's aspiration. It's a person imagining themselves in snow, rock, ice, wind. Some are remote, some are wild, some were untouched. The skeletal bird logo became associated with a particular kind of authenticity. And then the company attached itself to more than 1,000 fireworks exploding across an alpine landscape. That contradiction is brutal. You make money because people love mountains, and then you help turn one into a spectacle with terrible consequences for the environment for many seasons until it can recover, and just for 52 seconds. The company apologized, but an apology doesn't rewind the explosion.
Well, maybe us climbers are hypocrites too then.
Yes, before the climbing community becomes too comfortable pointing fingers, there is another uncomfortable question. What exactly do climbers do to these mountains? Commercial expeditions, they bring tents, they bring the ropes, oxygen bottles, fuel, food, generators, human waste, helicopters, base camps, hundreds of clients, thousands of kilograms of equipment. We fix lines into the mountains. We build temporary villages on glaciers. We chase speed records, first ascents, youngest records, oldest records, fastest records, no oxygen records, double 14 peak records. Then we post sponsor logos from the summit and we leave all that stuff there.
What exactly is the line then?
Well, Arc'teryx used the mountain commercially and people became furious.
But commercial mountaineering also uses mountains.
Yes, but they use them differently. Maybe one feels noble to us because it belongs to the climbing culture.
Yeah.
Maybe the other feels obscene because it doesn't. That doesn't mean they are environmentally equal. They're not. But it does make the moral question more complicated.
So you're saying the fireworks were okay?
Well, no, I was not saying that at all. I'm saying the climbing world should be careful about claiming some absolute moral ownership of these places, because maybe that's exactly the debate China is forcing us to have. And now, come back to Nims Purja, because his climbing career almost perfectly frames this entire mystery. In 2019, 13 mountains completed, one remains, Shishapangma. China closes it. Nims waits. China eventually opens the door. He climbs. Project Possible becomes history. And the same thing later in 2024 when the final mountain, Shishapangma, was closed again. But somehow he had obtained a permit and climbed it, and the no O2 record was done. Then in 2026, another enormous objective. Not simply 14 mountains, but all 14 twice without supplemental oxygen. Gasherbrum 2 completed. Broad Peak was next. Then Cho Oyu. And again, China has closed the final mountain. The symmetry is almost eerie. The first two times the doors eventually opened, The third time around, Nims would never live long enough to find out. Broad Peak came first. The Avalanche decided that. And we should be absolutely clear about something. China did not stop Nims from completing his twice without oxygen project. Broad Peak did. He died before Cho Oyu became his immediate final climb. But if he had returned safely from Broad Peak, the next obstacle waiting for him would not have been altitude. It would have been permission. Again, 7 years later, another final mountain, another locked gate.
So what happens now? Can somebody break Nims Purja's record?
Some already have. His famous 2019 speed record is
Oh.
gone. Kristen Harila and Tenjin Lama Sherpa shattered it. His fastest completion of the 14 without supplemental oxygen can theoretically be challenged, and the unprecedented record he was chasing as well, climbing all 14 twice without oxygen, is still open. Somebody could become the first, but not right now. If the remaining objectives require the closed Tibetan mountains, you cannot complete all 14 without Shishapangma. It's one of the 14, and Shishapangma is entirely inside Tibet, and Tibet is following the absolute laws of how China is administering the north side of Everest. There is no alternate country. You cannot substitute another peak. You cannot say, I'll do Everest twice instead. 14 means 14, and that means China holds one of the keys to every complete 14 peaks project on Earth. Maybe that key turns again next year. Maybe not. But until it does, part of mountaineering's record book is effectively frozen, not by snow, not by altitude, but by access. September 19th, 2025, a fuse is lit. More than 1,000 pyrotechnic begin exploding across a Tibetan mountainside. A dragon appears, it climbs, it burns, smoke drifts into the air, and 52 seconds later, it's over. The dragon disappears. But the questions it created don't. Who approved it? Why? What happened to the land? Who was responsible? Were the people controlling those approvals actually doing their jobs? What else did investigators find? Why did international climbing permits become caught in the aftermath? Are the closures genuinely about environmental protection? Is there something deeper, some sort of conspiracy being created here? Is this a geopolitical hoax? What exactly is happening inside the system that controls access to some of the highest mountains on Earth? We know some things. The environmental damage was investigated. Officials were disciplined. Arcteryx apologized and was assigned restoration responsibilities. A senior Tibet Sports Bureau official later came under an official disciplinary and legal investigation. Foreign access to major Tibetan climbing objectives remains restricted. And an August report alleges that authorities have examined possible corruption around foreign expedition permits. China and Tibet are calling for a far better management system of the ecology of the mountains and also a better understanding of what that land means to its people. But the final allegation is not independently proven. So there are still pieces missing. And maybe that's why this story is so fascinating, because the mountains actually haven't moved. Only the rules around them have.
So what do you think? Should the mountains stay closed?
And now I want your answer, the listeners. Forget Nims for a moment. Forget records. Forget Netflix. Imagine you are responsible for these mountains. A global outdoor company sponsors a massive pyrotechnic event across fragile alpine terrain. People are furious. Investigators find problems. Officials who approve the event are punished. Questions arise around the approval system itself. What do? Do you reopen everything immediately because ordinary climbers did nothing wrong? Or do you say, no, not until we understand what happened, not until we improve the system to be working efficiently and create better policies? Not until we're confident these environments are being managed properly. However, there's an uncomfortable truth here. The climbers may be innocent, but the mountains don't owe them access.
Of course, but shouldn't Arcteryx pay the price instead, or they're going to raise the prices of the climbing permits?
Well, they should absolutely be held responsible for their part. As far as the climbing permits increasing in price, I do smell something like that in the near future. And China did assign restoration and compensation responsibilities. But that still doesn't answer the bigger question if the system itself failed. Is punishing one company enough? Somewhere right now, there may be a climber with 13 8,000ers completed. Maybe Shishapangma is the last one. Maybe Cho Oyu is the last one. They've spent years imagining that summit, and it's still there, snow blowing over the ridge, prayer flags somewhere lower down. The summit hasn't vanished. The route hasn't vanished. The climber hasn't lost the ability to climb, but there is a border between them and the mountain, and that is a very strange kind of failure because climbers understand losing to the mountain. You get caught in a bad weather, you turn around, you aren't strong enough, you come back. But how do you process losing to a locked gate? Maybe you wait. Maybe you get angry. Maybe you accept that access was never yours to demand. And perhaps that's where every viewer will land differently. Nims Purja's first great double 14 peaks without oxygen story ended because China eventually opened a mountain. That became his final one. Broad Peak reminds us how little control climbers have over mountains, and the closure of 3 other mountains reminds us how little control climbers sometimes have, even before reaching them. The 14 highest mountains on Earth are still standing, every one of them. Everest, K2, Kanchenjunga, Lhotse, Makalu, Cho Oyu, Dhaulagiri, Mansalu, Nanga Parbat, Annapurna, Gasherbrum 1, Broad Peak, Gasherbrum 2, Shishapangma. 14. Nothing has disappeared, and yet for foreign climbers, some of them currently might as well be gone. All because somewhere in Tibet, on September 19, 2025, a company built around the love of mountains helped light a dragon across one for 52 seconds, and almost a year later, the smoke is gone. But the controversy isn't. So tell me what you think. Should Arcteryx, the artist, and the officials responsible bear the consequences while China reopens the mountains to climbers? Or did the fireworks expose a larger problem, making the closures justified until China understands exactly what went wrong? And perhaps the hardest question of all, who gets to decide what these mountains are for? The climbers who risk their lives on them? The companies that make money from them? The government that controls them? The people who live beneath them? Or perhaps the mountains themselves?
And what happens to someone else? Nothing is impossible project. It's someone else's. Then when the final mountains are closed to climbers.
Well, it brings us back to the hardest part of climbing a mountain. That is being allowed to begin. Thanks for tuning in, guys. I'm Rima, and this is Reembok Arcane. Don't forget to like and subscribe. Hit the share button. Definitely comment on some more topics you would like to hear, and we'll see you on the next one. Take care.